Ukraine, Berlin and Brandenburg, Professor Dr. Serhii Plokhii. He is on WebEx with us, as you can see from the screen, and will be having his talk directly from USA, and we are very honored to have him as a speaker. And maybe we'll give a couple of words to Oksana so that she can better introduce him.
So thank you so much, Pane Serhii. I would just give a few words about Professor Plokhii. Serhii Plokhii is a Ukrainian historian and author specializing in the history of Ukraine, Eastern Europe, and Cold War studies. He is the Mykhailo Hrushevs'kyi Professor of Ukrainian History at Harvard University since 2007, where since 2013 he also serves as the director of the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. He studied history and social sciences at the University of Dnipropetrovsk, now Dnipro in Ukraine, where his professors were Mykola Kovalsky and Yuri Mytsyk. He then gained his PhD from the Russian University of the Friendship of Peoples, specializing in historiography and source studies. He habilitated in history from Taras Shevchenko National University of Kyiv. Between 1983 and 1991, Professor Plokhii taught at the University of Dnipropetrovsk, where he was promoted to the rank of full professor. In 1996, after a number of visiting appointments as the Ramsey Tompkins Professor of Russian History at the University of Alberta, Professor Plokhii joined the staff of the university's Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies. There he founded the research program on religion and culture. In 2009, he received the Early Slavic Studies Association Distinguished Scholarship Award, and in 2013, he was named the Walter Chernin-Cabot Fellow at the Faculty of Arts and Sciences of Harvard University for scholarly eminence in the field of history. In 2015, he received the Antonovich Prize. At the Harvard Ukrainian Institute, Professor Plokhii leads an international group of scholars working on MAPA, Digital Atlas of Ukraine program, which brings the latest innovations of information technology to studies of modern Ukrainian history and contemporary political geography. His books have been translated into many languages, including Lithuanian, Chinese, Estonian, Polish, Portuguese, Romanian, Spanish, and Ukrainian, and won numerous awards and prizes. My personal encounter with the book was The Man with the Poisoned Gun, and I strongly recommend it to all of you. It's not the most recent book, but because it brings together a very sensitive point of Ukrainian history. It's about Bogdan Stashevsky, the killer of Stepan Bandera, and German history, because he spent quite a long time in Germany, where he killed Bandera in Munich, but also in Berlin, where he defected just the night before the Berlin Wall was built. The way how painstakingly it's reconstructed, it reads really as a creamy, and I strongly recommend just this particular book, but all other books that Professor Plokhii wrote. And now I give you the word. Thank you very much for agreeing to give the keynote today.
Thank you very much for this really very generous introduction. I hope that you can hear me. Please let me know whether the sound is fine. Is it fine? Okay, it's fine. Wonderful. Again, I wish I would be there with you in person. Unfortunately, because of how difficult it is to train these days, but also because of the fact that the academic year here in North America is already in full swing, and we have to stay close to our students. So it's good that we have this opportunity through the technology to meet and have this discussion. When I was invited to give the talk, I agreed, it seems to me, right away on the spot, but it took a while for us to figure out what to talk about in general. And then I favored more of a more specific talk and discussion, and my guests wanted something broader. And we came with this title, Beyond the Gates of Europe, which is a reference to the book that was published 5 years ago, actually 6 years ago in 2015, 5.5. The title of the book is The Gates of Europe. It's about Ukraine. It's about the Ukrainian position on the numerous front lines and numerous dividing lines, including the line between Europe as defined by the Western civilization and Western Christianity, and Europe that, again, was formed to a great degree by the influence of Byzantium. So that is one dividing line that is there, but it created a special space in which Ukrainian modern history was developing and Ukrainian modern identity was created. Another so-called moving frontier, again, the line that divides but also unites, is the line between the Ukrainian North and Ukrainian South. And Ukrainian North is defined historically since time immemorial by the forests, and the South is defined by the steppe areas. And the Ukrainian history very much, for a long period of time, is formed through this movement of the population from the north, from the areas around the Sna, and also from the west areas around Carpathian Mountains into the steppe areas toward the Black Sea and toward Azov Sea. So there are this, what I write about in the Gates of Europe, for those of you who maybe had a chance to familiarize yourself with that book, is that the Ukrainian history is very much the product of these two moving frontiers, the one between Eastern and Western Christianity, and it creates a hybrid church which was banned and now is back, certainly developing very, very rapidly and dynamically. This is the Ukrainian Catholic Church, Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, the largest church between East and West in the world. And this is just a symbol of Ukrainian culture, religious culture, and culture in general, as being formed between those two worlds, Western and Eastern. And another very important symbolic part of Ukrainian history are the Cossacks, which are the product of this movement of the frontier between the settled areas in the forest areas and the nomadic areas in the south. So as the population moves south, it creates this new social group, new social strata that eventually creates a state of its own in the 17th and 18th century, the Cossack state that became known as a hetman. So this is a very general introduction to the approach that I exercise to when writing about Ukrainian history, thinking about Ukrainian history, not only in the Gates of Europe, but also in some of my other works. So as I thought that I will introduce that particular division or that particular dynamic in Ukrainian history to you, and then we'll try to unpack that, putting more and more emphasis on the aspects of Ukrainian history that link it to Europe defined in a number of ways. So that was the thinking at the time when I agreed to give this talk and this presentation. And what happened in between was that on the Kremlin side during the summer months, an essay appeared by the president of Russia, the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, which put the issues of Ukrainian history and also Russian history into the center of not just academic attention, but also political attention. Because the essay that is called On the Historical Unity of Russia and Ukraine, or Ukraine and Russia, really questions the right of Ukrainian nation to exist, or the existence of that nation, and questions the right of the Ukrainian nation to have a state of its own. The argument there is that the history of the two nations, of the two groups, is almost indivisible, that all the attempts that were undertaken during the 20th century, in particular during the Soviet times, to undermine that unity allegedly led to very dismal results, led to nothing. That the unity of the East Slavs, the unity of the Russian nation, continued and persevered into the 21st century. So this is a very important, in political terms, statement, which, as I already mentioned to you, really has very serious implications in terms of undermining the claim of Ukrainians for their separate nationhood and their separate statehood. If you look at the way how the nations and states get formed in Europe in particular in the 19th and 20th century, you will find that this birth certificate of the nation, so to speak, issued by the historians, that the nations that we have today have this historical roots, have this historical legitimacy. This is one of the founding elements of any national, not just history, but national politics, and again, the right of a nation to exist. So what that means is that I will try to highlight in my today's presentation, and again, I am aiming probably for speaking for something like 35, 40 minutes to leave time for questions and discussion. But what I will try to do, I will try to basically talk about Ukrainian history, certainly as a history of the European nation, European people in context and in connection with Europe, something that is promised in the title. But also I want to make and develop an argument in very general terms, given how little time we have. That despite the facts that indeed there are commonalities in Russian and Ukrainian history, and there is a long period of existence within the one imperial structure from the Russian Empire, then the Soviet Union. In case of Ukraine, we have partially because of connections to Europe, but not only because of that. In case of Ukraine, we have a history that is quite different, certainly from the history of other neighboring nations, including Polish, Turkish, but also including Russian and Belarusian for that matter as well. So that is what maybe the main argument at the end of the day of this very general survey of Ukrainian history will be. I will start with not with history, but with the contemporary developments in the region, because the question of what history does is still not very clear for I would say, the majority of the population, certainly in Ukraine, and I would say quite a few of people who are not involved in history. Quite often I hear again and again of, why do you rewrite history? History probably not a real, a proper scholarly discipline, or not quote unquote a science per se. And the idea there is that history probably should be a little bit like physics or biology or something like that. That once certain issues are already discovered, there is no need of going back to them and somehow rethink it. History is created differently because history has a very important social function in our society that maybe other sciences per se don't have. History is located in this area between humanities and social sciences. When when we speak about the social function of history, the social function of history is try to explain to us today who we are, where we are coming from, and try to understand the processes that are happening today with us. Try to find those roots, to find parallels. So history, it's always a look back at our experience as individuals, experiences as societies, from a particular point in time where we are right now. And depending on that particular point of time, we formulate our questions. For example, for today, for us, again, in the context of the war in Donbass, the Russian annexation of the Ukrainian, the issues of Russian-Ukrainian relations in history are extremely important. Democracy is very important for us, and those issues probably were less important, let's say, 20 or 30 years ago. And as we face different challenges, we ask different questions, and we go back to history, trying to use whatever the methods are there available. And again, methods change also with the computer technologies, with the ability now, for example, to read and understand DNA and trace back the movements that were there in prehistorical times. So this is in general terms a few words about history. Now, what that means for our topic. One way to think about Ukrainian history is to explain why Ukraine is not Russia, something that was formulated, the title was formulated by a former president of Ukraine, Leonid Kuchma, back during his presidency. This is the title of the book that he published at that time. And if you think about what is different between today's Russia and Ukraine, probably the most obvious answer that one would get would be the issue that Ukraine is a democracy. We have issues here and there, but it is a democracy. There were two attempts to introduce some form of authoritarian rule in Ukraine, and both of those attempts ended up with Maidan protests, the Orange Revolution of 2004, the Euro Revolution, and then Revolution of Dignity in 2013-2014. This is very different, let's say, from what happened in Russia, where the short period of the democratic development really came to a halt in 1993, less than 2 years after Russia really became separated itself, or was separated from the Soviet Union. And a very legitimate question in that sense, when you think about Russian and Ukrainian history, is try to understand through history why Ukraine is a democracy. Others, neighbors, the neighbors that are close in cultural terms, close in religious terms, and so on and so forth, are not democratic. History provides an answer to that. And we can think about the history working toward that ultimate result, so that the Ukrainian democratic society today already starting from the times of Kievan Rus. Kievan Rus, this is exactly where all the narratives, not just Putin's narrative of the unity of Russia and Ukraine starts. Kievan Rus, this is the period where, again, there are references again and again to Kiev as the mother of Rus cities. Well, the trick is that what the term mother of the Rus cities meant in translation from Greek at that time was that it was the capital of realm. There was not about any kind of a mother, father, uncle, grandfather's relationship. The term was really used to define the capital. And Kiev was the capital of the huge realm of the empire, medieval empire that existed in Eastern Europe between the 10th and 13th century, and starting with the 9th century. What that meant to be a capital, really? That meant that capital was a big city, first of all, compared to smaller cities on the periphery, an established city, and a city in which the princely power was really limited by the power of the citizenry, was limited by the power of the city gatherings, city council, the so-called Vichy. This was true for Kiev. This was true for another quite old center of the Kievan Rus, which was Novgorod. Further major cities, but there was no checks on the power of the ruler, on the power of the prince in the areas that were further to the periphery, the areas that were conquered as the result of the war, where there was no major, or at least originally, there was no major big centers. And the part of that periphery was certainly the area where later, already in the 15th century in particular, emerges a very powerful state of the Muscovite Russia, emerging from the period of turmoil that was closely associated with the Mongol rule over the area. So you start from the very beginning and you see these differences in which the life around Kiev and areas in Ukraine is characterized by this competition between the princely power and the power of the citizen. The same story we see in Novgorod. But Novgorod tradition is being crushed by the more authoritarian Muscovite tradition already in the 15th century. So again, in Russian territories, we have these two different trends that are there. But one, the authoritarian trend, emerges quite victorious quite early, already in the 15th century, and then that continues into the 16th century as well. Another important part of Ukrainian experience that differentiates it from the experience of Russia, but is common for Ukrainian history and Belarusian history. This is existence and non-existence within the borders and boundaries of one state, which happened to be not Mongol state, which happened to be not Russian state. The state was called the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. And eventually, through a number of dynastic and then state unions, that state merges into the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So the combination of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and the Kingdom of Poland produces this new polity, very powerful polity in Eastern Europe. Ukraine and Belarus are part of that, and they are certainly open to all sorts of influences, cultural, political, and otherwise, that come from Central Europe. One of those influences is, of course, the Western Christianity and the traditions associated with the political culture of Central and Western Europe, in which there is a division of powers between the secular power, the power of the prince, and the power of the church, the power of the bishop, who is protected by the Pope in Rome. So again, you have this situation in which the power is not unified in one place, where the king is quite weak, and the powers, the limits on that power of the king, the limits on that power of the ruler, are placed not only by the church, something that I just discussed, but also by the power of the nobility. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth is known as the Republic of Nobles. Republic of Nobles in which there exists a parliament, a diet, and not just one central big parliament or diet, but the key decisions on the local level are also made by this smaller diets or dietines or Seumenicht, as they're known. Again, admittedly, not the entire population is take part in that process of a democracy, of early modern democratic process of government. But the elite is there, and the elite is quite significant. So this is an experience that Ukraine and Belarus has. But for a number of reasons, Russia that develops along the different lines with much less power belonging to the nobility, that Russia doesn't have that particular experience. In Russia, we have the so-called Zemskие Sobory, the Council of the Land, which are really bodies that are there to consult, to provide some advice to the ruler, but not the bodies like the Polish, the Sejm or the parliament, the Diet in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth that really decides the key issues, the budget, the issues of the war, the issues of the taxation, can limit the power of the ruler on a number of issues, including the issue of religion. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth emerges as a state of many religions in the 16th and the beginning of the 17th century. The long period of the tolerance for different religious groups that is observed there until mid-17th century. Again, the entire generation, or more than one generation, 2, 3 maybe, are being formed and have this experience of existence of different groups, religious groups, and not just Christian. Again, first the Renaissance and then the Reformation, the quintessential European processes that are also at play in Ukraine and Belarus in the 15th, 16th, 17th century, and they're not at play for a number of reasons in Russia. So again, something that can be maybe erased for a short period of time by the movement of the Russian Empire into the region, by the introduction of the authoritarian forms of rule. But this is also becomes to a degree a cultural and political DNA of the society as a whole. And the DNA that continues exist by not only on the level of nobility, but also in the cities and in the towns. The Magdeburg law that calls for the self-rule in the cities is again a very important part of the Ukrainian experience of the early modern period. There can be an argument that, well, the majority of the people who partook in this form of democratic government within the cities were not ethnic Ukrainians, or were not ethnic Belarusians, who were not Orthodox, those were the minority. But this is missing the point, because those minorities in the cities, like Ukrainians and Belarusians, despite the fact that maybe they minimally were taking part in that process, they had a model. They had a model in front of them. That's how the society is organized in the city. That's how the politics are made outside of the city in the noble dietines and the noble courts. So far, what I'm talking about really draws this line of separation between the Ukraine and Belarus on the one hand, and Russia on the other. You can also ask, okay, if there are this tendencies toward the democratic development deeply rooted into the history of Ukraine and Belarus, why we have, at least for now, for today, different outcome in terms of the democratic development of Ukraine and Belarus. And answers, there can be a number of answers to those questions, but I want to put emphasis on something that the social order, the institution that the Ukrainians had in their history and Belarusians didn't. And that institution is the institution of the Cossacks and of the Cossackdom as a social phenomenon and as a political phenomenon. Something that came into Ukrainian history out of necessity, out of this geographic position of the proto-Ukrainian groups as they started moving into the steppe areas. The Kazaхдom starts on the foundations of the military form of democracy, election of their leaders, the execution of those leaders by the Kazakh Rada, Kazakh Council, if they didn't like the way how they handled the last military campaign, and eventually creating of a state in which the power of the hetman was never absolute. The power of the hetman was undermined by this mobilization of the Kazakh elite and by the power of the superior, which would be either Polish king before the Khmelnytsky uprising, or it would be the Russian Tsar. So one way or another, in this Kazakh state, the authoritarian power, there is no conditions for the creation of that authoritarian power. And there is plenty of opportunity to exercise forms of democracy or semi-democracy, something that not just Russia doesn't have, but also Belarusians don't have as well, because the phenomenon of Kazaхдom, despite the fact that many of the first Cossacks come from southern Belarus, they come on Pripyat down to Dnieper, to the Poroks, to the Dnieper Rapids, and Cherkasy and Kharkiv and all these Cossack places. They're full of Belarusians coming from southern Belarus, but they become a Ukrainian phenomenon. And Belarus is not really familiar with that form of the Kazakh state, Kazakh tradition, and forms of Kazakh democracy. Kazakhs are important not just in their own right. Kazakhs are also important as a fact that up until the mid 19th century, when the emancipation of peasantry finally takes place, when the serfdom is abolished, parts of southern Ukraine still have the population who are not Serbs, never been Serbs, never experienced what did it mean to not have personal freedom, right? The entire Khmelnytsky uprising in the 17th century leads to the situation in which there is no serfdom on the territory of the Kazakh state. And serfdom is being slowly reintroduced in the late 18th century by the Russian Empire. And by the mid-19th century, it's already gone. So again, this is quite a unique experience, which probably some would say accounts for Ukrainians being such a successful rebels and maybe lousy state builders. Again, the idea is that Ukrainians always live in a state that is not perceived to be their own, with the exception of the Kazakh state for a short period of time. Now, going back to the things that are really linked Ukrainian history with the European history, that is the story of the part of Ukraine that plays extremely important role in the 19th and 20th century. That is the history of Galicia, of Transcarpathia, of Bukovina. So the areas that, as the result of the partitions of Poland by the major European powers of the late 18th century, that part of Ukraine ended up not within the borders and boundaries of the Russian Empire, but it ended up within the borders and boundaries of Habsburg Empire and eventually Austria-Hungary. What that means, among many other things, is that when the Revolution of Nations of 1848 in Europe comes along, takes over the entire Central, Western, Southern Europe, from Italy to Paris to Krakow. The Ukrainian population actually experiences this revolution of 1848, which comes with a number of very important developments. And one of those developments is that the end of the serfdom there comes a decade a little bit more earlier than it comes in the Russian Empire. But that's important, but not the most important factor. What is the most important is that in 1848, as the result of the revolution, some of the peasants from Galicia, from Bukovina as well, acquire electoral rights and are getting elected to the parliament. So the democracy arrives in the mid-19th century and encompasses now not just mobility, not just the people who lived in the cities and in the towns, but embraces also the peasantry, which is personally free, very poor, but personally free, and has this rights to vote and to be elected. And they're not just rights that are declared. Some of those people are elected and have to travel all the way to Vienna. So the period of the democratic development, the experience of electoral democracy is in today's Galicia, Transcarpathia, and Bukovina already from the mid 19th century. And this is the part of the experience that most of Central or Western, Central or Eastern or Southern Ukraine didn't have, and certainly Belarus didn't have, and Russia didn't have as well. And as we move to the formation of the modern Ukrainian nation, the nation that is imagined and executed during, after the end and around the end of World War I, the nation is imagined as the lands from the Sian to Don, as the Ukrainian anthem says. It's Sianu do Donu. So that includes both the Austrian and Russian parts of Ukraine. There are issues with that. It's sometimes very difficult to find a common language for representatives of these two groups. Today, the Russian historiography keeps repeating and saying again and again, Ukraine somehow came together from different nations and different countries. But that is an interesting experience in its own right, this unification, and the need to find language that would make that nation work. And that need leads to the again, the ideas, not just to the conflicts which are, of course happen, but also lead to the idea of the tolerance, of the ability, whether you want it or not, to listen to each other and look for compromises, because very often, like it has been the case, for example, in Ukrainian parliament, until very recently, there is no one outright majority, and the norm in Ukrainian politics after 1991 are some forms of coalition, some forms of compromise. This features of Ukrainian history really came to the fore after Ukraine became independent in 1991. Before that, Ukrainians didn't live in the state of their own. It was very difficult to say what were the features of the Ukrainian political culture. Were there any particular features at all? They came really to the fore only with the ability to experience, to live in your own house, to live in your own state. So we really were discovering ourselves in terms of our political traditions. And again, for historians, the task was to look back and try to figure out, okay, to what degree history, not just politics, not just economics, not just geography, but to what degree history is maybe responsible for us today and for our successes and for our failures, and what that means for us today and what that means for us tomorrow. I'm talking now probably for almost more than 30 minutes, and again, I'm doing that online. I know that it's quite a challenge to listen and to follow. So I probably will wrap up here with more or less where I started. And I started with the issue of Ukraine today, and Ukraine today being a democracy. We are in many ways we are influenced by the past. We are influenced by our previous experiences, but we are certainly not. Our future is not predetermined. The choices are out there. The alternatives are out there, and it's at the end of the day, it's our decisions of where we are going, what path we choose, and what decisions we make. I can tell you that in the course of the last few years, starting with the events of 2013, 2014, the Maidan protests, the start of the war by the Russian Federation against Ukraine, which led to the annexation of the Crimea and the continuing war in Donbass, major historical changes are taking place in Ukraine and Ukrainian society, which are influenced by the past, influenced by the history. But I have no doubt that they will also influence the developments in the future, because the period that we are living through is a historic period in more than one way. In 1991, the state was created, but the nation, the process of nation building of the modern Ukrainian nation just started. The nation that could actually live in the state of its own, that could benefit from that state. And 2013, 2014, and the last 5-6 years gave a major boost to that particular process. The mobilization in the conditions of the war, the loss of, again, let's hope temporarily loss of significant territories, the Crimea, the parts of Donbass area, led to the formation of a new sense of unity in Ukraine, formed for the first time in decades the generation of people who are prepared to risk their lives for the choice that was made back in 1991, very often not by them, but by their parents and by their grandparents, to risk their lives for the existence of this state and for the existence of this nation. So it is a historic development. It is something that we didn't have before. And I personally believe that it's many of these things that are happening today, that they're irreversible. So we are in this moment of history where history on the one hand made us, but now we are making history. So it is a dialectical process, and I probably will conclude with saying that I think we all should feel some responsibility for what is happening today with us, with the society, with the relations between Ukraine and Europe, and generally for many people here in this audience, certainly like myself, come from Ukraine, but work either in Europe or in the US. So for us, it's the important question, the important issues, the responsibility for the way how the dialogue, how relations are being formed now between Ukraine, which is a very, very young nation by the standards as an independent state, by the standards of history, and the old nations of Europe and the world. Again, I'll stop here. Thank you very much for your attention. And at least I guess we still have maybe 10 to 15 minutes for questions. If you have any questions, I will be happy to answer them.
Thank you so much, Pane Serhii. And I would like Thank you so much, Pane Serhii. And now I would like to ask the audience for questions. And please, if you have a question, come here so then Professor Plokhii can see you if you speak here in this microphone.
Serhii, thank you very much for your nice lecture and for the format that you took also. I think it was very exciting for all of us. I understand you made a point of democracy as one of the issue or one of the attribute that you would put in the certificate of the nation, which would make a difference. But I would like to make one point, maybe you agree or disagree with me. The democracy is not enough if it couldn't defend itself. So basically, imagine the history of Ukraine will last for 50 years because of dramatic changes. It will be zero in history. So I would like to see your point about this. And second question, again, just opposing you, if democracy will be introduced in Russia, as Bolsheviks can do it, would it also be possible for reunification of the Ukraine and the Russia again? So what's your opinion about that? Thank you.
Thank you for both questions. And I certainly agree that democracy has to have ability to defend itself. Democracy, despite the maybe a lot of noise that we have around ourselves, is not the most natural choice. It's a very difficult form of government. Again, Churchill was saying that democracy is the worst form of government except every other. And democracy is also not the first choice when you look at the formation of the new states. Look at the new states that were being formed by the new on the ruins of the Austria-Hungary and the Russian Empire in East Central Europe, from Poland to Hungary to the only exception was the Czech Republic. Those were centralized authoritarian regimes. Look at most of the post-Soviet space. Ukraine and Moldova are really exceptions. You look at Russia, you look at Belarus, you look at Kazakhstan. There are different forms of authoritarian rule because, again, given the difficulties that this new societies, new economies, new states face. Look at post-colonial Africa, and again, if you talk about democracy, very often it is tribalism. So again, it's a very, very complex mechanism that you know how to operate it, and it works successfully on its own in the countries with a particular historical tradition. If democracy can't defend itself, it doesn't survive. Now, what that means for Ukraine? My impression is that given our history, we are really predetermined to be democratic, at least in the short term. Again, we are talking now about some forms of, for the first time we have the majority in parliament. And we are talking about the threat of authoritarianism. That's how sensitive we are to the issues that the power can be concentrated in one hands. And given that we are democracy, given that attempts to turn us into Belarus or Russia were undertaken twice and didn't succeed, we have no choice but learn how to defend itself. And it's not easy, and the successful outcome is not guaranteed. But knowing not just Ukrainian history, but having some feel of the of the Ukrainian society, I don't see it turning into the form of Belarusian autocracy or tolerating that kind of regime. So it's almost I hate to use this formula that okay, there is no choice, there is always a choice, but in Ukrainian case the non-democratic choice is extremely problematic. I think it's more dangerous for the society than democracy, despite all problems and issues. So again, I used a lot of words, but I hope you understood my main point there is that we are democratic. We'll probably continue to be democratic. We have to learn to defend, and Ukrainian society has to learn to do that. In terms of Russia and Ukraine, again, I don't want to say that somehow if the two societies are democratic, then that means that the other factors are not there, that they're somehow the same people. Ukraine and Poland are democratic, but it doesn't, or Poland may be less today for a number of reasons, but it doesn't mean that it has to be the same state. I put emphasis, given the short period of time that we have here, on democracy, but there are other factors that are certainly at play when it comes to Ukraine and Russia. Some of them are very clear and very obvious in terms of a different cultural tradition, in terms of the existence of a different language, despite of the Russification of the maybe majority of the Ukrainian population in the 20th century. The language is there, the culture is there, survived despite 150 years, almost more than half of a century and a half of some form of persecution, and there were periods of Ukrainization in the 1920s, but they were short-lived. So again, democracy is an important part of the story, but that is by far not the only characteristic, either nation in general or political nation in general. So it's difficult for me imagining Russia going democratic in the short term, in the short run, and it's even more difficult for me to imagine some form of reunification of Ukraine and Russia, unless it is done on the conditions of how it's happening today in Donbass, which means war and occupation.
Okay, hi. Thanks a lot, Professor Plokhii, for your very insightful lecture, and I really take with me the idea of the Cossack state as the source of Ukrainian political pluralism. I think it's really interesting insight. And I have a question to you as a historian and also as a communicator of history, because you have sort of started already your lecture telling us why Ukraine is not Russia. And I'm wondering, does Ukraine always have to communicate its history as something that is not Russian? Is there maybe a value of developing the discourse and the narrative that is Ukraine is what it is, and talking about what it is? And if you maybe know already certain moves in that direction, if you can recommend us maybe literature that highlights that rather than quote like our former president and his marvelous book. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm not sure about the marvelous book, but certainly the title keeps coming back again and again. In terms of Ukraine is not Russia, yeah, this is the leitmotif certainly of our today's topic and discussion in light of this essay or article by Vladimir Putin. But there is a broader context to that as well. And sometimes, especially, it's not, you don't need to do that for Ukrainians, for the majority of Ukrainians, but if you're outside of Ukraine, Russia and the Russian Empire is actually a known entity. for a number of reasons, for its today's geopolitical position or behavior on the international arena, but also because it was for a long period of time an empire, which again a so-called quote-unquote historical nation. So it is there in the major textbooks. It is there in the historical imagination of people in Europe and in the United States. So very often it's just inevitable and is needed to start the discussion, to start the conversation. But you're absolutely right that this approach, it has serious drawbacks. And the Ukraine, the point is a representation of Ukraine on its own terms, in its own right. And that is basically what I certainly try to do most of the time when I don't react to a particular article. Again, The Gates of Europe, or maybe some other books that you had a chance to look at, and The Man with the Poison Gun was mentioned. Yes, Ukraine is there, and Ukraine is there at the central point, of attention for me, and I hope for the readers that pick up my book as well. The question is, okay, what does it mean, Ukraine being in its presented on its own terms and its own right? And then my answer is was formulated more or less at the start of my presentation. It's also the key framework of The Gates of Europe, where I talk about Ukraine as a society that was produced by the unique combination of the local history and this international developments, and these two moving frontiers, basically civilizational frontiers, between Eastern and Western Christianity, and the settled and not settled territories, which eventually turned out to be the homes for Islamic civilization and Christian civilization. So the Ukraine as a product of that unique circumstances, that's what makes it unique and goes beyond the immediate questions of what language people speak today, goes beyond the immediate questions associated with even with things like democracy. But again, it's maybe a broader and more global issues that are responsible for our formation. So that is my response to what is unique to Ukraine, and that's how I try to think about Ukrainian history and about us.
Professor Plokhii, thank you very much for this very inspiring talk. I have two questions. The first question is about the Hetmanat, and in economic history there is a lot of discussion about legacies, about the extent to which borders of empires or of prior state institutions or territories influence contemporary outcomes. From your experience as a researcher of Ukrainian history, do you think that there are legacies of the Hetmanat visible today in contemporary Ukraine? And would this make a suggestion about, would this form a basis for reform or development? And the second question relates to the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. I mean, as you know very well from other cases, in Southeastern Europe, the church and the formation of an independent church has always been a harbinger of nation building. Me and my group have actually applied for a project to the German Research Foundation comparing the Bulgarian independence, ecclesiastical independence in the 19th century with Ukraine today, and how, I mean, to essentially identify the process of ecclesiastical self-determination and nation building. Do you think that essentially there will be a positive effect? So what do you think would be the effect, the societal and identity effect of the creation of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine by the Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople? Thank you very much.
Thank you for both questions. In terms of the hetmanate and historical borders, I didn't do that during my today's presentation. I didn't show the results of our work at the project called MAPA, Digital Atlas of Ukraine, but I want to invite you to go and to look at the different modules that we have there, trying to map Ukrainian history, Ukrainian politics, attitudes, war in Donbass, you name it. It is there. So for those who are interested either in Ukrainian history or in Ukrainian politics today, I encourage you to do that. But I do this invitation also in response to the question about the borders. And if you look at the history of the electoral map of Ukraine after 1991, and the movement of the forces associated more or less broadly with national liberal or just national orientation in the politics, like Ruch during the first days and years of Ukrainian independence, or then let's say the electorate that was captured by Viktor Yushchenko or Yulia Tymoshenko. Up to the 1914, there is a very interesting story that emerges on the map, which really follows the historical borders of Ukraine. If you look at 1991 presidential election and support for Vyacheslav Chernovil, the most kind of a national, pro-nationalist oriented, again, the nationalism was liberal of Chernovil in particular, orientation, you see that he captured support of Galicia. So one of the Austrian regions. As you see where the next presidential elections draw the border, you see that Kravchuk, who was playing now the card that was played by Chernovil before that, captures already not just Galicia, but Western Ukraine, including Galicia, Volhynia, and it seems to me Bukovina as well, where that means the interwar border between the Soviet Union and the Polish Republic, interwar Polish Republic is there. And then you look at Yushchenko and Tymoshenko, and they move already to the Dnieper, the former border between the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and the Russian Empire. It's in terms of the hetmanate per se, you can certainly see the difference between the way how the Poltava Oblast, for example, and those regions which were part of the hetmanate vote differently from let's say Kharkiv, which was Sloboda Ukraine, was not hetmanate, and vote differently, let's say, from Odessa. So maybe the borders are not so clear and so pronounced of the hetmanate, but still they are there. And when you look at this again, the déjà vu, the repetition of these borders, now translated into the voting patterns, you suddenly, it occurs to be, wow, history matters, because maybe once that broadly speaking coincidence takes place, another, but if it keeps repeating itself, that tells you something about the importance of history in the formation of a particular group in society. In terms of your project that you are working on and applying for, extremely interesting because on the one hand, Ukraine belongs to the one way or another, the majority of the Christians there belong to this tradition, Byzantine tradition, which of course comes with the unity of the secular power and the religious power, but it's a little bit different history, because Orthodoxy is under pressure for a long period of time in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Another Eastern Church, the Union Church, a Greek Catholic Church, is not under pressure, only under pressure, it is banned, right? So you have a church that, according to its tradition, is ready to work closely with the authorities. The authorities belong to a different denomination. The authorities want actually to eliminate you or to keep you at bay. And then 1991, finally you have a Ukrainian state. Finally, the Orthodox image of the two powers coming together seems to be very close to realization, but it is not, because by that time, by 1991, you have already two different traditions, Greek Catholic and the Orthodox. The autocephalous or other that compete with each other. There are differences between the Orthodox. So Ukraine continues to be a very pluralistic place with three different Orthodox churches. So that the model, the ideal of the Orthodox unity is just couldn't be realized in Ukraine before 1991 for one set of reasons, and can't be realized now after 1991. Now, what happens with the creation of the Ukrainian this new Orthodox Church? It looks like a movement into the direction of this the Byzantine model of unity of the church and the state. At least it looked like that for a few months, but then President Poroshenko, who is an important part in that story, loses the election, and his successor, President Zelensky, is actually not there to particularly embrace any particular church, including this newly created church. So the illusion of the few months that Ukraine is moving in that direction is turned out to be illusion and not more than that. That being said, the creation of that church has a very important historic implication, given the relations with the rest of the Orthodox world, and in particular with Russia. For the first time since the 17th century, the Orthodox believers in Ukraine acquire the ability to belong to the internationally recognized so-called canonical church, which is not under Moscow. And again, in terms of one of the maps that we created was the movement of the parishes from the Moscow Patriarchate to the newly created church. That module is still there. You can look at that. You can look at the data that we used. The numbers are not huge, but again, for looking at that from the historical perspective, this is a change that really happened. It measured in terms of the 200-300 years. So for the first time in 300 years, that opportunity emerged. So it is there. It will be working. It will be functioning in the future one way or another. So it is a major turning point. But again, I don't see basically Ukraine moving along the same path as Russia, for that matter, or maybe some other traditional Orthodox countries like Greece. It is too pluralistic, not only in political terms, in historic terms, but also in religious terms.
Thank you so much. There is one more question we would allow, and then would kindly ask you to answer quickly, because we are a little bit over time, and here it's already quite late. There is one more question we would allow, and then we would ask you for a quick answer, because we are a little bit running over time.
I know we're already at least 9 minutes over time, yes. And you're sitting, you don't see that there is a banquet, there are no tables, there is no wine, there is no coffee. So yeah, I think it makes sense to wrap it up. Yeah, I'm listening.
Okay, good evening, Professor. Thank you very much for this presentation. I hope my question will not need too long answer. I had a question concerning the Russian speaker, Ukrainian Russian speaker. There are a large majority in Ukraine. They are raised in this culture. They may also develop that culture. When you speak about the need for unity, do you think that it will be at the cost of this minority, and or on the contrary, embracing the Russian culture? So I don't mean Russia, but the Russian culture could be a way to peace the current situation. Just as a context, I come from Switzerland. I'm from the French part. I have the impression that my compatriots contribute to the French culture, but don't tell me that I am French. That will not be something. Do you think that Ukraine can play a role in building the Russian culture, but without being Russian? Thank you.
Thank you. Very important question. My reading is that Ukraine is still there on the map today and survived the Russian assault of 2014 and 2015 because the society was able to mobilize across the cultural and linguistic lines. So the Russian aggression came with the idea whoever speaks Russian, the loyalty allegedly is to Russia, and it didn't work that way. The war in Donbass today, again, I don't know what the percentage is of Russian speakers who are there fighting for Ukraine. So the response was really mobilizing across the cultural divides and linguistic divides. But also what happened since in the last 5 to 6 years was that there was a realization that language and culture were also issues of security. The Russia didn't try to somehow create Novorossiya or New Russia in Ukrainian-speaking Volhynia or Galicia, but was trying to do that in predominantly probably this is right, especially when it comes to the cities, Russian-speaking areas in the east and in the south. So there is a tendency of, especially among the young people, actually switching to Ukrainian. So there is the war led, the Ukraine survived that first attack through the mobilization across the linguistic lines. But the outcome of the war was actually the mobilization of the Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian language, and so on and so forth, especially among the young people. Now, the voices that Ukraine has to claim Russian culture, part of the Russian culture, is there, and my understanding is that people close to the current administration, presidential administration, to the government are raising those questions. From what I can see from, again, we all live in this bubbles with our friends and Facebook and so on and so forth, there is a pushback to that idea. So, but again, Ukraine is a democracy, and I'm very happy that these issues are being debated and dictated. Where eventually it will lead, I don't know, but I would bet more on the increased role of the Ukrainian culture. And for the first time, we see the situation in which potentially very dangerous situation for Ukraine, that Russian culture becomes a minority culture because of the loss of Donbass and Crimea. And that means that all the European legislation that was there finally works for the Russian culture, because before that it wasn't a minority culture. But it's extremely, extremely painful process of the transformation for the carrier of a dominant culture, which was Russian, especially in the context of the cities, to the representative of minority culture. And again, I certainly foresee a lot of debates and a lot of tension and very unpleasant situations there in the future. But that's the direction that I see right now. The increased role of the Ukrainian language and culture and transformation of the Russian language and culture into minority ones. Again, I don't know how long it will last. It can certainly turn, it can reverse, it can be frozen, but that's where it seems to me we are now. again, thank you very much for your questions. Thank you very much for staying with and again, being there and being online. I know that we are all sick and tired of Zoom, and I really wish I could be with you now today in Berlin. Thank you.
I would like also to use the chance to show the books you sent us with your signature, which would be given as a present to our winners. So they arrived from Harvard with signature of Professor Plokhii, and now we will have a thank you so much for your talk and for the books.